From the Washington Commission for the Humanities, a state program of the National Endowment for the Humanities, UC Video, Minnesota, and by the many individual contributors to the Bainbridge documentary project.
I haven't even told my kids about it because, I just can't talk about it. It's just...
Get set, go!
Bainbridge Island, Washington. Japanese Americans celebrate 100 years of residence here with a picnic. Islanders are proud of their ethnic diversity. Bainbridge is a place where different immigrant races have learned to live together and care for each other. But it was once put to the test. Bainbridge Islanders were the first Japanese Americans moved by the Army to internment camps during World War II. Their evacuation agonized and polarized this small community. Some Islanders were brave enough to speak out against it, but many others remained silent. It's a part of history that is almost too painful to talk about, yet impossible to forget. Bainbridge Island is 8 miles west of Seattle in Puget Sound. Only 30 minutes by ferry from jobs in the city, the island remains a country paradise, a quiet and safe place to live and to rear a family. But it was not always this way. December 1941. The U.S. was at war, and on Bainbridge Island, 300 people looked like the enemy.
I wasn't particularly scared or anything. Japan's way over there, America's way over here, and we're American citizens.
It didn't matter. The U.S. fleet was crippled at Pearl Harbor, and the West Coast, with its numerous military installations, prepared for the worst.
We came very close to going under as a nation. We were really fighting for our existence.
On Bainbridge Island, strategically located between a naval shipyard and defense industries, people feared they were next in line for attack. They looked suspiciously at the Japanese in their midst.
It was utter confusion because no one knew anything really, truly. And rumors were flying all over. There were submarines off the coast.
There were rumors that there were known to be hidden radios transmitting messages out.
There were rumors that Japanese spies had been apprehended.
They claimed that they arrested some Japanese people that were taking pictures up above the Navy Yard over there.
Japanese immigrants first came to Bainbridge Island in the 1880s. They worked hard, saved their money, and by World War II, most had acquired small strawberry farms. Like other Asians, they were prohibited from citizenship, but their American-born children were United States citizens by birth. On Bainbridge, Omotos grew up with Johnsons. Nakatas lived beside Joneses.
I started in the first grade with 19 Japanese children and 12 Caucasians, and they were always the smartest, the dearest, and the nicest kids in the class.
Yet there was little other mixing of the races. The Japanese were excluded from the American melting pot. In the West, Asian Americans had endured years of racial and legal discrimination.
I still felt like I was a second-class citizen because we were denied so many things. We could not work, for instance, at the Navy Yard or Boeing or join some of the unions.
Have you ever watched a well-trained monkey at a zoo? Have you seen how carefully he imitates his trainer? The monkey goes through so many human movements so well that he actually seems to be human. But under his fur, he's still a savage little beast. Now, consider the imitative little Japanese.
War hysteria. Japanese victories in the Pacific bring nightmares of invasion. Bainbridge boys begin dying on distant battlefields. National leaders and much of the popular media fail to distinguish between the enemy and Americans of Japanese ancestry. Responding, Japanese Americans tried desperately to demonstrate their loyalty.
We disposed of everything that was Japanese, magazines and books, records. What we could burn, we burned, and what we could bury, we buried.
It didn't matter. At first, radical white supremacy groups, and eventually almost everyone on the West Coast, demanded the removal of all Japanese from coastal areas. But Walt and Millie Woodward felt differently. They were publishers of a weekly newspaper, the Bainbridge Review. The night after Pearl Harbor, they stayed up late to print an extra edition. They asked their readers to remember that the island Japanese had nothing to do with the bombing.
The aim was to prevent hysteria, panic.
But the FBI rounds up hundreds of Japanese-born people suspected of loyalty to their mother country. Agents raid Bainbridge Island homes.
They saw my father go to the corner and pray. And he said, "This is my country. This is my adopted country. I haven't done anything wrong, and God knows that."
Those arrested are not charged with any crime, but are sent to detention camps anyway. Dynamite for blasting stumps, shotguns for shooting crows. The agents take them too, plus cameras and radios. These could be used to help the enemy, they say.
Okay, who's hiking the ball then?
Hisa Matsudaira was younger than the children she now teaches when the agents came and her mother told her her father had been taken away to prison.
I even remember the dress she had on, and she was crying. And that was the first time I ever saw my mother cry. And the only prisons that I knew were criminal prisons. And I couldn't figure out why they had taken Papa and put him in prison.
Even the FBI roundup failed to quiet West Coast demands for removal. Several government investigations had confirmed the overwhelming loyalty of Japanese Americans, but Army officers believed that an espionage net, including Japanese Americans, was already active. President Roosevelt was urged to remove all persons of Japanese ancestry from coastal areas. The president, supported by Congress, complied. Virtually the entire West Coast press supported the action, but not the Woodwards.
Anybody who has ever bothered to read the Bill of Rights knows that that's a clear violation of that Bill of Rights. There was no court order, no warrants issued.
Japanese Americans were the first uprooted by the Army. On March 23rd, signs went up on the island ordering the evacuation of all Japanese, aliens and citizens alike, within a week. The government made no arrangements to protect their farms and businesses. Walt and Millie Woodward were angry. Week after week, they had advocated tolerance and justice for island Japanese American citizens. But theirs was a lonely voice.
We were accused at times of being Jap lovers.
There were many people that felt sympathetic towards our position, but very few of them came up out front and became a visible target like they did.
Review editorials drew fire from readers, and the paper lost advertising and subscriptions. But the Woodwards stood firm.
If it could happen to Japanese Americans, it can happen to Scottish Americans or Italian Americans or Rotary Club Americans or fat Americans or skinny Americans.
Come on, Fishy.
Shigeko Kitamoto had only a week to prepare to leave her home. She would be allowed to take with her just what she could carry. Her husband was in a detention camp. She had 4 small children and so many things to take care of. Myrtle Norman has been Mrs. Kitamoto's friend for 50 years. When the evacuation order came, she offered to help Shigeko get ready.
I says, well, I'm going to be left behind, and you're going to be taken care of, is what I said. Trying to cheer her up, I just didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to relieve her mind with 4 little babies.
She always take care of my children and just kind of pick me up, and she was real nice to me.
Some Bainbridge neighbors helped the Japanese by storing property and by assuming management of farms and businesses. But not everyone was so generous.
We had other people come, wanted to buy our refrigerator and washing machine and so on. And they offered a pittance, and I said, no, I'm not selling.
Students knew evacuation was coming. At Bainbridge High School, a quarter of them were of Japanese ancestry. They were class officers and star athletes. An integrated Bainbridge baseball team played its final game just before evacuation. Walt Woodward remembers seeing the team's Japanese-American catcher after the game.
He was very dejectedly walking, I guess, to the locker room or something, and somewhere out of nowhere, a very beautiful blonde girl, a student at the high school, audibly crying, ran after this catcher, threw her arms around the whole mess, player and chest protector, kissed him, and ran off crying.
On the morning of March 30th, the evacuation begins.
There was no way we could fight it. How could 272 Japanese on the island fight a company of Army soldiers? And, you know, more than one soldier had tears in his eyes.
Everything is abandoned at gunpoint. The Japanese are brought to the Bainbridge ferry dock, where their friends have come to say goodbye.
My whole class and the classes prior to mine and behind me, younger than I was, were there. And they were just devastated.
We followed the buses down, and we were holding their hands, and everybody was crying.
Just imagine your good friends being kind of herded on the ferry.
Just like they were treating them like a bunch of cattle.
To be marched under those conditions with the soldiers with their bayonets and everything else, that was one of the most humiliating experiences I've ever gone through.
In Seattle, the Japanese are led to a waiting train.
When they were going down through Seattle, we spotted them and we ran after the train, and we were all crying and waving goodbye to them. I was a paratrooper in the Pacific, and I fought the Japanese, but these kids here are still, you know, my real good friends, and they always were. And I mean, it was, you were fighting a war with different Japanese people. I mean, it was just different somehow.
It took 2 days for the islanders to reach their destination, a dusty camp in the California desert.
We arrived in Manzanar on April Fool's Day.
Hearts sank when the islanders realized these partially built rough lumber and tar paper barracks would be their new homes. Only one small room per family.
We had the lineup for everything, you know, at the mess hall, and there was also a lineup at the latrines at the same time, practically, because everybody became ill.
The exodus of West Coast Japanese Americans that began on Bainbridge Island ended in 10 relocation centers like Manzanar. More than 100,000 people, 2/3 of them American-born citizens, were confined by barbed wire and gun towers for the duration of the war. But the islanders adapted. Part of Bainbridge High School graduated at Manzanar. Sam and Kay married. Grandpa Kura died. And one day, Hisa Matsudaira's father, released by the FBI, rejoined his family.
Papa came home, and I ran away, and I hid in that bathroom all day long from the morning, and I didn't go out to lunch, and I could hear everyone calling me. I could hear Papa calling me to come out, but I just hid in there, and I was so ashamed of it. I didn't want to come out. And I always had this feeling that he was a criminal.
In the Bainbridge Review, the Woodwards ran a weekly column from camp. Births, engagements, even softball scores were news. Sa Nakata was a camp correspondent.
I think it was just to make us feel that we were still a part of Bainbridge and that we could possibly return to Bainbridge. It was our home, and he wanted us to feel that we had a home to come back to.
But some islanders, like Shigeko Kitamoto's husband, feared they'd never return. He wanted to sell their farm.
I said, no, he's wrong. I kept saying myself, he's wrong. I'm not going to sell it. I have to have a place to come home.
The next year, most Bainbridge Japanese were transferred from Manzanar to join other Seattle area people at Camp Minidoka in southern Idaho. Some received permits to work outside camp as farm laborers, others to go to school. Young men, like Islander Art Kura, were eager to prove their loyalty to America and volunteered to fight in the Army. As part of the famed all-Japanese 442nd Regimental Combat Team, they earned the most medals of any American fighting unit.
The main attack rolls down from the north. 3 years of relentless effort is rewarded. 5-star General Douglas MacArthur sets his people free. The recapture of Manila sets the stage for the big show, the drive on the Japanese homeland.
By late 1944, the German and Japanese armies were retreating, and the war was winding down. The Supreme Court ruled that loyal Japanese-American citizens could no longer be kept in camps against their will. The islanders dreamed of returning home.
I disagree with your statement in a recent editorial that on Bainbridge only a few rabble-rousers oppose the return of the former island Japanese. I do not want them as my neighbors.
We ask that the rights of our Japanese neighbors be respected. Keep up the fight for right, Mr. and Mrs. Editor.
As the war winds down, Bainbridge Island is embroiled in a battle of its own. The Woodwards say the Japanese should be welcomed back to the island, but many islanders disagree. Gail Smith wrote letters supporting the Woodwards.
With flying and drums are rolling, that brings out all the Latin fascists that are around that would be ashamed otherwise to surface. I'll give her one, and then I'll make
Smith says he heard one man mention possible armed opposition to the Japanese return.
I think at the time I told this guy he'd have to step over me and my shotgun before he could carry out any rough stuff like that.
At the same time, This booklet appeared on Bainbridge. Its author was Islander Lambert Schuyler.
He was an all-American, he said. And he organized this meeting and advertised it as a mass meeting about the Japanese problem. Walt was sick and couldn't go.
The truth is, I was scared to death. But I bravely sent my wife and daughter out to cover it.
And there was quite a mob there. And his plan was to send all the Japanese and their lovers, which I'm sure included the Woodwards, to some island in the Pacific where they could be by themselves.
I managed to get a little courage back on the second mass meeting and found there were about a dozen people there, and that the reason for the other 288 people being present at the first time was just curiosity. Bainbridge Island wanted to know what was going on, and when it found out, it had nothing to do with running the Japanese off the island.
Loyal Japanese Americans will start returning from internment camps to their homes on the West Coast next month. However, many West Coast congressmen have bitterly opposed the return of the Japs. Some of them have predicted there will be bloodshed and riots when the Japanese return.
Not a single Japanese American was ever convicted or indicted for spying or sabotage, but West Coast resentment against them still ran high.
The day of days for America and her allies. Crowds before the White House await the announcement from the president that the Japs have surrendered unconditionally. Seattle let loose all the pent-up emotions of 3 years and 8 months of war. Washington is jubilant. And in Chicago, more than 1 million sing and dance in the streets in the biggest celebration the
While the nation celebrates, Japanese Americans, fearful of trouble, quietly return home. Some encounter organized opposition, even arson, but not the Bainbridge Islanders.
They didn't come back as strangers. We already knew that so-and-so had married so-and-so and that they had a baby boy, and we were looking forward to meeting the new baby.
Half of the Bainbridge Japanese returned to the island. Shigeko Kitamoto and her husband found their farm well taken care of by Felix Narte, a Filipino neighbor. In gratitude, they gave him land on which to build a house. But not everyone was as fortunate as the Kitamotos. Japanese Americans lost hundreds of millions of dollars worth of property. On Bainbridge, they suffered fewer losses, but the emotional consequences of their forced exile may never be measured. Bainbridge Gardens greenhouse and store was an island showcase before World War II. Today, it stands rotting in the rain. After the war, the store was reopened, but the gardens had fallen into disrepair. Junko Harui's father, who owned them, never had the heart to rebuild.
There was nothing left. My dad never did say anything about how shattered he was, but obviously it must have broke him inside and out.
Years after evacuation, the Japanese Americans are re-established on Bainbridge Island and reintegrated into the community. Once again, they have earned a comfortable living and the respect of their neighbors. Only Akio Suimatsu still grows strawberries, but the past is not forgotten. Island Japanese Americans have begun a project to document their history. School children learn about Bainbridge minorities, including the story of internment, from a specially prepared textbook. And the Woodwards have been honored by the Japanese community for their stand during the war. A presidential commission has unanimously declared that internment of Japanese Americans was unjustified. But arguments continue on Bainbridge Island.
Taken months to sift through the Japanese population and decide who was a loyal citizen and who was not. And it was much more expedient to send all of them to an area where they could be controlled.
The Bill of Rights give us our liberties, our freedoms, our citizenship rights. And the government violated those rights when they evacuated Japanese American citizens. And it must never happen again.
August 1984. 50 years of Bainbridge High School graduating classes share a reunion. It's a gathering of friends.
How are you? Good, how are you? Good to see you. What year did you graduate?
Visible Target was made possible in part by grants from the Washington Commission for the Humanities, a state program of the National Endowment for the Humanities, UC Video, Minnesota, and by the many individual contributors to the Bainbridge Documentary Project.